Names should be as short as possible while still being clear. This sounds controversial. Let's read. Phil Carlton, a programmer who worked at Netscape, he said, there are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. Any boomers in my chat who remembers Netscape? Who used Netscape? I've seen the icon on a school computer's desktop, but I never clicked on it. I had the other icon, the E icon, that stood for Internet Explorer. It's actually easy to name things. Oh boy. The hard thing is naming them well. Maybe if it were harder to name them, we'd spend longer choosing good names. But what kind of manager in the right mind would allow you to spend too much time picking good names? Some developers do use names that are too short. However, I think the more common mistake is using names that are overly long. This sort of goes against the advice, the general advice, the advice that is given to everybody who's learning to program. Pick good names, even if they have to be long. Make sure they're descriptive. That's what matters. But, as we might just see in a little bit, you can go overboard. Let's keep reading. Long names make it harder to see the important information. For example, imagine if Bob, just out of uni, was designing the request library, and one of his lecturers had said, name a function to explain what it does. That's not terrible advice, but he heard, name a function to explain everything it does, and wrote this: send get request and receive response. Oof. See what happens when you take it too far. So the function is pretty descriptive. Sends a request and then receives a response. It is exactly what an HTTP fetch function would do. But doesn't it look ugly? Wouldn't something simple as just get response be enough? Or just get? Using it would look like this. Ugh, look at that. Verbose, right? And explains exactly what it's doing. What's wrong with that? Well, the extra words don't add anything. In fact, they take away clarity. Request.get is easy to see and read, whereas with the longer name, the important part, the fact that it's a get method, is hidden in the middle of the name. The word request appears twice, once in the module name and once in the function name. And then there's a send and receive response, but the entire point of the library is to send requests and receive responses, so that's unnecessary too. You're left with the short and sweet request.get, which says perform a get request clearly and succinctly. Did I pronounce that correctly? You can't get any shorter than that. I mean, you could make it request.g, a real G, but that's just silly. I'm a strong advocate of designing a module to be used with the module name as dotted prefix. Requests follows this. Get wouldn't make much sense on its own, but request.get is clean and clear. You don't get name clashes because the module name is right there to disambiguate. In other words, don't name things to explain everything they do. Name things so the meaning is clear in context. Bet you never heard that before. You're always told, long names, good. But as you can see, not always good. Using succinct names is only important when you're designing a library, but also when you're writing regular code. Local variable names can usually be short because the context is provided by the surrounding code, the function or the script they're in. Let's look at an example. Recently, I saw this code in a repository statistics.py script. Holy shit. Look at that. It's like reading a book, but it's not English. It's pseudo-English. It's trying to be English. Let's actually read this. Repository index retriever equal repository index retriever args.architecture. Repository statistics processor equal repository statistics processor. For repository object in repository index retriever, retrieve repositories. For repository file in repository object, repository files. Repository statistics statistics processor. Increment repository file count. Repository file name. For repository file name count, in repository statistics processor, get top and repositories 10. Print repository file name count. Whew, that was a lot. A lot of letters, but it's not really doing all that much. A bunch of loops, and then it prints. So many big words. The simple logic of the code gets lost in verbiage. Here's how we would rewrite the code. Oh, and repository statistics processor was a glorified collections counter, so let's use that. Oh, look at that. Wow, short and sweet. Straight to the point. Fetcher equal repo_lib index fetcher. Counts equal collections counter. For repo in fetcher.get repos, or file in repo.files, counts file name +1. For repo count in counts most common 10, print repo count. And it was quick to read. It means that I'm not gonna easily lose myself while reading this whole thing. Been big, but not that big. Same structure, but the logic is now much easier to see. And in Python, you often have one-line list comprehensions or generator expressions. When writing those, you can go even further and use one-letter variable names. When both users are on one line, F may be just as clear as file or file object. And I agree with that. Over time, over the years, I've begun doing the same. For the most part, I would only use I for loops and even J. But as time went on, I've began shortening variables, variable names that are short-lived. If they're only going to be used in a scope that contains 1 or 2 lines, I'm not going to bother to give them a long name. Just give them a short name. Short and sweet. If it doesn't look confusing when it's short and sweet, I'll leave it be. But if it feels like something is missing, I can just easily rename the variable right there. I always try to go with the simple approach first. If it doesn't work, well. For example, we could change the inner loop to use counter update with a generator expression in a one-letter variable name. Look at that, all in one line. And it's easy to read. Counts update fname for f and repo files. I'll finish with a quote from Russ Cox, tech lead of the Go project, who states his variable naming philosophy this way. A name's length should not exceed its information content. Global names must convey relatively more information because they appear in a largely variety of contexts. Even so, a short, precise name can say more than a long-winded one. Compare, acquire, and take ownership. Make every name tell. The last sentence is poetry. But I'll conclude by restating my own, more prosaic, variable naming philosophy. Names should be as short as possible while still being clear. And I've adopted that as well. I just didn't really ever put it in a short and sweet sentence like that. Nice article. Links in chat. What do the people on Reddit have to say? Nah? No? And doubt always err towards clarity instead of brevity. But you can also be clear and concise while also being short. Let me give you an example. When you're iterating through an array in C, you would never think of naming the iterator variable, the variable that is being incremented, index. You would never call it index. You call it I. Short and sweet. And you can apply that same logic everywhere else. If short and sweet is just good enough, or even perfect, go with it. Don't be, what's the word? A dogmatic programmer. The example in the article of an engineer writing a name that describes everything a function does is a straw man. Of course, if you include implementation details in the name, it's superfluous. I would argue that was not the case. Because when you make a request in HTTP, you are making a request, and then you are receiving a response. It's not how it's implemented. It is how it works. It is what it's doing. You don't just make a request. Be done with it. You expect a response. Although technically you could make just a request. It's a single request and not even wait for the response. But that's a very specific case. You wouldn't even think about it. It also probably means you're violating SRP. What is that? SRP. What does it mean? The single responsibility principle. Really? Finally, someone who thinks the same as me. Most of my variables are Y, I, J, K, or X. Sometimes I'll use Bob. Oh, he's a funny boy. Long names can be just as bad as short names. I inherited a Java codebase. I'm sorry. Where the names were like 20 characters long. I was already expecting he was gonna say that. I feel his pain. In fact, I probably caused the pain somebody else as well. But half of them had the same first 10 characters. That's right. Go look at any Java codebase. You're gonna stumble upon that. Very likely. I was constantly having to reread and reread again to make sure if I was looking for sum of invoices with specials or sum of invoices without specials. I feel you. That's a fake example, but it is about right. Actually, no, because the previous dev would abbreviate weird things like he'd do something like sum of invoices W specials and sum of invoices WO specials. Oh, pay attention. See that? And to make matters worse, he had terrible spelling typo problems. Oh god, imagine the bugs it could have caused. He could have very well misspelled sum of invoices WO specials for sum of invoices W specials. And finally, he would change the meaning of the names without changing the variable. Holy crap. It's like seeing a variable called green being assigned a green color and changing it to a blue color, but keeping the variable name green. Isn't that fun? I've had that fun. I've got to enjoy that. So it would turn out that it wasn't invoices at all, but purchase orders, which is different. Like I said, that's a contrived example. In reality, it was worse. The variable names were often longer than that, and you'd make 3 different typos of the same thing. Threshold became threshold, threshold, and threshold. And sometimes just fresh. Oh boy.